1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
10,
10,
10,
Figures 2.11, a rare old picture showing a dilapidated arch and the great Dendera temple behind it. We see its main northern entrance. The drawing was made by the French painters who accompanied the Napoleonic troops during the Egyptian invasion. Figure 2.12, a reconstruction of the Dendera temple done by French painters of the late 18th through early 19th century. We only show the right portion of the reconstructed facade here. The reconstruction in general was apparently done rather conscientiously. However, one immediately notes the curious fact that the faces of the statue columns on the reconstruction significantly differ from those of the original drawing. Also see Cron 3 Part 2. The original stone faces with chipped noses have high cheekbones, differing from the ones depicted by the restorers of Egyptian history. It isn't quite clear just what considerations the French artists were guided by and why they would have to substitute becoming Greco-Roman faces for the original ones with high cheekbones. Figures 2.13, rear view of the great Dendera temple. We see utter devastation, most probably caused by artillery or powder kegs placed under the foundation of the buildings. Figures 2.14, rear view of the great Dendera temple. The devastation wasn't necessarily caused by the French troops. It may have been the result of the Ottoman conquest of the 15th through 16th century, when the troops of Moses that came from Horde Russia or the children of Israel, the army of Joshua, were conquering their very own Egypt, cleansing it from the plague that reigned there, from the epidemics. In other words, over the centuries elapsed since that time, a large part of the ruins have become buried in sand. However, the sand may have gathered over a matter of decades or already accumulated by Napoleon's era, which means it would have only taken several years. This is quite possible since the strong dry winds of Egypt carry sand continuously. Figures 2.15, modern condition of the Dendera temple. The low wall around the temple is built from large blocks. The stonework is done accurately. Figures 2.16, modern condition of the Dendera temple. Figure 2.17, a bird's eye view of the Dendera temple and its environs. The temple and the constructions around it were erected as a Christian monastery. One sees a tall wall containing a considerable amount of space around the temple. Figure 2.18, a copy of the round Zodiac done by the painters of Napoleon's Egyptian expedition. Figures 2.19 and 2.20. Figure 2.19, a picture of the zodiac and the planets from a medieval French astronomical manuscript. Planets are depicted as human figures. The figure of a warrior with a sword and shield is explicitly subtitled Mars. As we see similar symbolism, wanderers with staves is also used for planets in the ancient Egyptian round zodiac. Figures 2.2. Close up of the fragment depicting Mars as a warrior. Figure 2.21. Medieval picture of the planet Jupiter. The thunder god is holding a thunderbolt in his hand and has a royal crown on his head. Jupiter's chariot is rolling over the zodiacal constellations, taken from a book by Ione Tensinero titled Opus Mathematicum Octolibrium, the book archive of the Pulkovo Observatory. Figure 2.2. 2. A medieval picture of the planet Jupiter from a book by Albnusar titled De Astru Scientia, the book archive of the Pulkovo Observatory. Figure 2.23. A medieval picture of the planet Saturn with a scythe over its head. The scythe looks like an Ottoman crescent, taken from the Compilatio de Astorium Scientia by Leopolds of Austria. Figure 2.24. A medieval picture of the planet Saturn with a scythe over its head. The scythe looks like an Ottoman crescent, taken from De Astru Scientia by Albumasur. Figures 2.25. Ancient Egyptian picture of the god Anubis with a jackal's head and pointed ears resembling the Ottoman crescent or a pair of horns. The specialists in the history of religion call this picture the mummy of Osiris prepared for burial by Anubis. Figure 2.26. A picture of Anubis from the famous Egyptian Book of the Dead. The pointed ears on the god's jackal head are painted in such a way that they resemble the Ottoman crescent or a pair of horns. Figure 2.27. An ancient picture of the constellation of Virgo from an astronomical book by Bachrach. Virgo is holding a bunch of wheat ears. Near her hand is the star called Spica, or the ear of wheat. Figure 2.28. Famous Egyptian Book of the Dead. The ancient Egyptian god Anubis is weighing the good and the bad deeds of humans on a scale. The subject is clearly a Christian one, popular in the Middle Ages. Figure 2.29. Another ancient Egyptian picture from the Book of the Dead. The subject is the same one. The comparison of good and evil deeds of humankind at doomsday. Its origins are clearly Christian. Anubis is weighing human deeds on a scale. Figure 2.3. Ancient Egyptian picture of the Christian Judgment Day as described in the biblical apocalypse. Jesus Christ is judging people. In front of him we see a scribe with a scroll, and somewhat further on is Anubis weighing the deeds of the people on a scale. This bas-relief, distinctively Christian, is kept in the Egyptian Thebes Mammonium. Figure 2.31. A similar Christian Judgment Day scene from an ancient Egyptian papyrus. Jesus Christ is judging people with Anubis weighing their deeds. It is evident that such drawings could have only appeared after the depiction of the apocalypse, not in the dateless antiquity that they are nowadays supposed to date from. 2.32. A close-up of the picture of the planet Venus on an old French miniature. The complete title of this astronomical miniature was Zodiac and the Planets, and it can be seen in its entirety on one of the preceding illustrations. We see Venus depicted as a woman in motion with the inscription above her head saying Venus. Figures 2.33 and figures 2.34. 2.33. Ancient miniature titled The Planet Venus from the Livre des Esches Amoureux. The planet Venus is depicted as a woman with the name Venus written above her head. Figure 2.34. A close-up of a fragment of the previous picture of Venus. 3.5. picture of the sun from a medieval book by Tisnero dating from 1562. The symbol of the sun, a disk with a dot in the center, can be seen to the left of the baculus in sun's hand. Figure 2.36. Medieval picture of the moon. Its astronomical symbol is a crescent. Illustration in the book by Tessanero dating from 1562. Here the crescent is also drawn on the head of the woman, the moon, but already in the shape of a pair of horns. This is how Moses used to be portrayed in ancient Bibles, with horns on his head, as it is pointed out in Cron 6. The implication is that the medieval painters would have had to be carrying on an ancient tradition of depicting the biblical Moses with a crescent on his head. Figure 2.37. A fragment of a bas relief located on the ceiling of the great Dendora capital, close to the entrance. Both discs are depicting the same celestial deity, worshipped by surrounding figures. The first disc, with an electron's eye, is inscribed within a crescent. What we are seeing most probably represents the solar and lunar symbols. The second disc, with an electron's eye, contains 14 identical glyphs that we presume to represent a half of the lunar month, namely the interval between the new moon and the full moon. Figure 2.38. A close-up of a fragment of the bas-relief near the entrance of the Dendera temple, showing either the lunar or the solar disk inscribed with a crescent. Figure 2.39. A close-up of a fragment of the bas-relief near the entrance of the Dendera temple, showing either the lunar or the solar disk with 14 glyphs inside. Most probably the glyphs serve to represent half of the lunar month, 14 days out of 28, or the period between the new moon and the full moon. The 14 figures are divided into two groups of 7, perhaps a pictorial representation of 2 7-day weeks. Figure 2.4. The ancient Egyptian Osiris as either the moon or the sun with his symbol, the disk with the head of an electron. Figure 2.41. The ancient Egyptian Osiris as either the moon or the sun with his symbol, an electron disk. Figures 2.42. An old picture showing the two-faced ancient Roman god Janus. Figures 2.43. Janus, the Roman god watching doors and gates from both the inside and the outside. Figure 2.44. An ancient picture of the planet Mercury with a caduceus from Tessanero's Book of Astronomy dating from 1562. Figure 2.45. A sculpture of Mercury with his caduceus resembling the Greek letter. A sculpture of Guillaume Bologna, allegedly dated 1564. Museum of Bologna. I'm sorry. Bologna? Bronze. That's funny. I'm getting tired. What do you want from me? I'm getting tired. The sculpture was most probably made in the 17th to 18th centuries at the latest. The finish is beautiful. The running or flying figure looks practically modern. Figure 2.46. Ancient Egyptian wooden sarcophagus found by G. Bruch in Thebes in 1857, allegedly dating from 90 A.D., taken from a book by Henry Bush titled Reconsul du Monuments. The Ancient Egyptian Pharaohs from the Universal Chronicle by Hartman Schedel, allegedly dating from 1493. They are portrayed as Christian kings of the 14th through 16th centuries, wearing imperial trefoil crowns. The ancient pharaoh Amenhotep is of particular interest to us since he's wearing a crown and holding an orb and a scepter in his hands. The pharaoh below him is wearing heavy gold-plated medieval armor, painted yellow on the engraving. The ancient biblical rulers Zimri, Omri, Achab, Jezebel, Ahaziah, and Joram. An engraving from the Universal Chronicle by Hartman Shedel, allegedly dating from 1493. They are portrayed as Christian kings. We see the imperial trefoil crowns on the heads of Zimri, Omri, Achab, Jezebel, and Joram. Uzziah has a Christian cross on his orb, but there are no crosses on the orbs of Zimri and Joram. Omri, Achab, and Jezebel have no orbs whatsoever. We can see that the authors of the Universal Chronicle portrayed different rulers with different royal regalia. This obviously indicates the possibility that these were referring to certain differences between them that have no meaning to us anymore. The ancient biblical rulers, Jehu, Jehoaz, Jehoash, and Jeroboam. The engraving is from the Universal Chronicle of Hartman, Shedel allegedly dating from 1493. They are portrayed as Christian kings with orbs and scepters. Jehu and Jehoraz have scepters with crosses. Jehoaz and Jeroboam have orbs with crosses. The scepters of Jehoash and Jeroboam have no crosses, and there are none on the orbs of Jehu and Jehoash. Section 4.4. Which astronomical observations of the ancients might be a result of late medieval theoretical calculations? Our idea is as follows. The chronologers of the Scaliger-Patavian school first created the erroneous chronology of the ancient and medieval history, having arbitrarily extended the real history of the 11th through the 12th century AD into the past. After that, in the 16th through 17th century, a great body of work was started in order to make this scheme look scientific and backed by the authority of astronomical calculations. If we are to call a spade, it was really a deliberate falsification of history. Number one, the ancient calendar theories were put forward. The chronologers of the 16th through 17th century began to reconstruct the ancient calendar systems that people had allegedly been using in antediluvian times for hundreds and thousands of years. The initial points of calendars would appear as a result of theoretical calculations as well as dates of the Genesis, the Great Deluge. Ding, ding, ding. The results of these calculations would be written into the ancient chronicles without any hesitation whatsoever in order to help maintain chronological order. What this meant, in fact, was the confirmation of mistakes or blatant falsifications of the Scaliger-Patavian school. Real medieval events assumed wrong datings that moved them a long way into the past. Nowadays, these ancient datings are considered to prove the Scaligerian history by historians who remain unaware of the fact that many of these calendar observations are a result in theoretical calculations of the chronologers of as late an epoch of the 16th through 17th century AD, yet another vicious circle. See, that paragraph alone, what if it's not so much of these guys trying to invent history because they want to do as Orwell says and validate the theory that he who controls the future controls the past, and he who controls the present controls the past? What if it's not this idea of control? What if it is that there was a cataclysm and everything was wiped out except for a handful of people that are trying to desperately reconstruct the past so that at least there's some semblance of a history? Back to the book. Number 2, certain horoscopes may have been calculated in reverse. Rough calculations of planetary dispositions may already have been known in the Middle Ages. The chronicles would then undergo special editing, after which they began to contain such passages as, in the 8th century, since the foundation of Rome on the day Julius Caesar was murdered, the planets occupied the following positions: The planet dispositions would be calculated exactly for the 1st century BC, since the astronomers of the 16th through 17th century already knew in their blind trust of Scaliger Petavius that Caesar lived in the 1st century BC. Nowadays, historians believe these astronomical observations to be the real thing and try to present them as proving the correctness of the Scaligerian chronology, which leads to a vicious circle. For instance, one of the astronomers/astrologers of the Middle Ages would first calculate that some astronomical event occurred in the 1st century BC. Afterwards, the fact that this dating was calculated would fall into oblivion, and the result of the same medieval calculation would be called proof of the fact that Julius Caesar really lived in the 1st century BC, just for instance. Number 3, first and foremost, a number of lunar eclipses were calculated into the past. Let us mention that the lunar eclipse calculations are rather simple. They were successfully performed already in the epoch of the 16th through 17th century. Solar eclipses are a different matter and involve a lot more complex calculations. However, in the 17th, let alone the 18th century, the astronomers were already capable of counting solar eclipses into the past as well. The calculated lunar and solar eclipses may have been included in the erroneous history of Scaliger and Petavius in the following manner. On the day such and such emperor died, an eclipse occurred. The process was apparently as follows. Having calculated that some eclipse occurred in the beginning of the 2nd century AD, the astronomer would take the Petavius textbook and see what emperor's reign coincided with the date of the eclipse that he had calculated. For instance, Scaligerian chronology would claim that some ruler died that year. The edited chronicle would then become altered to include some phrase like the moon or the sun darkened upon his demise. The examples of medieval calculations that were claimed, ancient observations, a posteriori, are given in abundance by the modern astronomer Robert Newton in his well-known work entitled The Crime of Claudius. Number 4, the appearances of certain comets may have been calculated into the past. Late medieval scientists, according with Tycho Brahe and Kepler, were already able to calculate their recurrence periods based on trustworthy observations. The Galley comet may serve as an example. Then the alleged dates of comet appearances were calculated by the extension of several recurrence periods into the past. After that, the erroneous Petavius textbook was used for reference, and the edited chronicles were altered to contain such phrases as, quote, in the nth year of reign of emperor such and such, a comet with a fuzzy tail adorned the sky, unquote. Nowadays, we are being convinced that the ancient astronomers really observed all of these appearances of the Galley comet in times immemorial. Moreover, these observations are nowadays presented as proof of the Scaliger-Petavius history textbook. This is not the case in reality. We shall cover comet datings in general and the Galley comet in particular in the chapters of Chron 5 that deal with the history of China. In the 19th and 20th century, even some of the professional astronomers were taken in, thinking that they dealt with true ancient observational material, which has led to the construction of theories that should have made the calculated trajectory of the Galley comet's movement more precise. However, such reconstructions invariably lead to the distortion of the very mathematical theory of the comet's movement, since certain constants in motion questions have to be obtained from empirical observations. If such observations are incorrect or simply fictitious, the constant values also turn out wrong. One sees just how serious the consequences for the history of science may prove, ones that arise from the late medieval chronological calculations that were slyly presented as true astronomical observations later on. These considerations are primarily valid for written sources. It must have been easy enough to take a quill and write the ancient observation down on the pages of the chronicle. Such suspicions are less applicable to trustworthy archaeological findings or the ancient monumental architecture, although great caution is required there as well. However, if a horoscope is presented as a large bas relief on the ceiling of an old cathedral or on a coffin in an old sepulchre, one has reason to believe that we see the result of a voracious astronomic observation and not a later calculation based on Scaliger-Patavius chronology. Number 5, Section 5. A brief account of several examples of Egyptian zodiacs. In this section, we shall give a rather brief account of the results of our research related in detail in Chron 3, 5.1, some general observations. The ancient horoscopes that have reached our days are a valuable body of chronological material. A horoscope's dating can be based on modern astronomical theory. Generally speaking, horoscopes may possess several astronomical solutions, but usually only one of them falls into the historical time interval. In this case, we may calculate the precise dating of this horoscope. However, the dating of horoscopes is a tricky business. The concept of using astronomy for the purposes of dating old documents was already familiar to Scaliger and the rest of the 16th through 17th century chronologers. Thus, the ones responsible for the forgery of history may have employed this concept and must have certainly done so. Since the written sources have largely been edited in the 17th and 18th century, as we understand, the astronomical information contained therein may also be a forgery, especially in cases when this did not require much time and effort, as in the case with horoscopes. The astronomers of the 16th and 17th century already knew planetary revolution periods well and could calculate horoscopes for any given date, including those pertaining to days long gone. Thus, in order to obtain certain chronological datings based on horoscopes and independent from the Scaligerian chronological scale, it only makes sense to use the horoscopes whose calculations in the 16th through 18th century is improbable. From this point of view, a horoscope carved in stone on the wall of an ancient temple is a lot more dependable than a horoscope included in an ancient manuscript. Carving a large and detailed bas relief in stone would require lots of effort. Apart from that, the construction of a temple is an event of high social significance that directly involves a large number of people. Writing something about the constellation that housed the planets on a given ancient date on a sheet of paper isn't nearly as difficult. This is office work. The history swindlers have been involved in precisely this sort of activity. It was only after Scaligerian history became consensual that it began to affect monumental construction as well as the 17th through 18th century. Furthermore, it is a lot easier to correct the horoscope in a manuscript while editing it than altering one carved in stone on a cathedral wall, which is hardly a possibility at all. Thus, the horoscopes contained in written sources are of little interest to what concerns independent dating. This particularly refers to the ancient Greek horoscopes, collected in the well-known work entitled Greek Horoscopes by O. Neugenbauer and H.B. von Hosen. Section 5.2. The Dendera Zodiacs. The image known as the round and the long zodiac nowadays have been found in the Dendera temple in Egypt. Multiple attempts of the 19th and 20th century astronomers to find ancient solutions that would fit the horoscopes depicted on the zodiacs have failed to yield any results. Such eminent scientists as Laplace, Fourier, Latron, Biot, and Helm have tried to solve this problem. The search for a correct solution was eventually abandoned after many unsuccessful attempts. Nowadays, the temple and the horoscopes are dated to 30 BC and 14 to 37 AD. However, it turns out that there are exact astronomical solutions. We shall give a very concise account of the matter presently, since part 2 of Cron 3 contains a detailed study of this problem. Dendera is a town in Egypt, north of Thebes, on the bank of the Nile. The ruins of the ancient town of Tintaris, with its remains of a magnificent temple, are located nearby. We shall reproduce several unique old drawings made by the French artists who accompanied Napoleon's military units on his Egyptian expedition of violent conquest towards the end of the 18th century. These drawings present priceless proof. They are extremely important documents since they reflect the state of the Egyptian monuments at the end of the 18th century. Right after the troops and the artillery of Napoleon had fought their way through the terrain, they can be considered photographs of sorts, reflecting Egypt the way it was in the late 18th century or the early 19th century, taken by eyewitnesses, members of the Egyptian campaign. Of course, they are far from being real photographs, but we have no reason to doubt that Napoleon's artists faithfully represented what they saw. In figures 2.11, we can see a dilapidated ark and a view of the main northern entrance to the Dendera temple. We can see that the buildings are largely in a decrepit state. We give a reconstruction of temple in figures 2.12 for comparison. Its authorship can most probably be credited to the very same artist who made the other drawings. What we see is thus their concept of what the temple really looked like prior to its destruction. The reconstruction is most satisfactory in general, figures 2.12, although the reconstructed faces on the columns are visibly different from the semi-obliterated stone originals. In figures 2.13 and 2.14, we can see the rear view of the great temple of Dendera. This was how Napoleon's artist would have seen it when the front line could finally advance, and Napoleon's troops entered Dendera. It is clearly visible that it wasn't almighty time that has caused most of the destruction. We see a scene of utter devastation here. The buildings have either been shelled or simply exploded with gunpowder. In figures 2.15, 2.16, and 2.17, one sees modern photographs of the Dendera temple. Pay attention to the immaculate stonework of the wall that surrounds the temple in figures 2.15. The piers supporting the foundation of one of the buildings that used to stand in front of the temple are visible very clearly. The building is a ruin. The stonework quality and the clever construction solutions give us an idea of the highly professional work of the ancient builders of the temple. In figures 2.17, we see a bird's eye view of the Dendera temple and its environs. One thing in particular that draws our attention is the tall wall that surrounds a large area around the temple and contains the remnants of other buildings. One gets the idea that the entire set was planned as a Christian monastery, possibly relatively recently. Two sculptural compositions from the dome of the great temple of Dendera have survived, the so-called round and long zodiacs. They are ancient bas-reliefs carved in stone. The round zodiac is about 2.5 by 2.5 meters. The round zodiac was taken to Paris and is now kept in the Louvre. The long zodiac was also taken to Europe. In figures 2.18, we can see the drawing of the round zodiac done by Napoleon's artist. It was published in the Fundamental Ouvre, titled Description de l'Egypte, compiled by the artists and archaeologists who accompanied Napoleon's troops in Egypt. The work was published under a direct order from Napoleon, which is explicitly stated in the subtitle Publi sous les odeurs de Napoleon de Bonaparte. Both zodiacs, the round one and the long one, contain images of planets presented as various human figures located in zodiacal constellations. Thus, what we have in front of us is a pair of horoscopes, which can be dated astronomically. These images have been discussed in astronomical literature as well as historical. The consensual dating of the zodiacs attributes them to 30 BC and 14 to 17 AD, respectively. However, this dating falls apart after the first criticism. The fact that the zodiacs and the Dendera temple contain horoscopes is reflected in their very names, and the zodiacal positions of the planets that they depict was noted by astronomers some time ago. The constellations and the planets are represented as human and animal figures in a standard Egyptian symbolism. Some of the figures are combined in the procession. An event as unique as the discovery of a horoscope in an ancient temple invoked great interest among astronomers. However, as we have already pointed out, astronomical research shows that ever since the distant past and up until the 3rd century AD, the planets did not form those celestial configurations observable on the Dendera zodiacs. On the other hand, the detailed accuracy of the bas reliefs was so great that the chronologists reluctantly formulated a hypothesis that the bas reliefs depicted pure fantasy, bearing no relation to actual celestial events. After that, no further attempts at dating the zodiacs were made. None of the astronomers thought of extending the research time span forward beyond the 3rd century AD. Attempts at deciphering the round zodiac started a long time ago. One should name Bruggs, Morozov, and Turiev in this respect. Zodiacal constellations are depicted very skillfully and form a zodiacal belt as one should rightly expect. Its visual representation is hardly any different from the ones in Bayer's star charts, for instance, or even the astronomical tractates of the 18th and 19th centuries. Identifying the planets, however, proved a lot more complex. N. A. Morozov offers a partial decipherment of the round zodiac in 544, volume 6, and the dating that was obtained as a result. Morozov's idea was simple, but truly revolutionary. If there was no satisfactory planet combination before the 3rd century AD, one should carry on with the calculations and go forward in time in order to cover those epochs closer to us. Morozov conducted all of his calculations on the intervals between the 3rd and the 13th centuries AD. As a result, he found one astronomical solution that could provide the key to this cipher, namely March 15th, 568 AD. This solution was then verified by the astronomer N. I. Idelson. See the details of his verification in the tables in 544. The Muscovite physicists N. S. Killian and D. V. Danesco made another attempt to date the round zodiac in 1992. Their work was published in MET 1, page 6. The date they came up with, given in the so-called Old Style calendar, is March 22nd, 1422 AD. Later on, in 1999, a partial decipherment and dating of the round zodiac were performed by T. N. Fomenko, who based her method on an altogether different concept and calculated everything from scratch. The result was as follows: either March 15th, 568, or March 22nd, 1422. The results of an extensive research of several important Egyptian zodiacs, such as the round and the long zodiacs of Dendera, and the greater and the lesser zodiacs of Esna, were published by T. N. Fomenko in Chapter 12 of the book, MET. The final solution, formulated by A. T. Fomenko and G. F. Nozvisky in 2001, is given below. The identification of the figures from the round and long zodiacs with contemporary astronomical symbols, as reflected in MET1, was based on the following method. The figures on the Dendera zodiacs were compared to the pictures of planets and constellations known to us from medieval atlases. It turns out that the symbols contained in both zodiacs are virtually identical to the ones used on medieval and even late medieval star charts. The planets on the Dendera zodiacs are represented as human figures, namely wanderers carrying staves. Planets were depicted in a similar manner in a number of European medieval books on astronomy. In figure 2.19, we can see a zodiac with planets from a medieval French manuscript on astrology. The planets here have the appearance of wanderers proceeding on their journey across the sky. Mars, for instance, is pictured as a warrior who walks with his shield and a sword in a raised hand, figures 2.20. The inscription near the picture unambiguously identifies the figure as Mars. In a number of such cases, the pictures can be identified as planets without any complications whatsoever. The medieval representations of the planet Jupiter sometimes emphasize the fact that Jupiter was a thunderer and the chief deity in Roman mythology. Jupiter's symbol is a royal crown. One of such medieval pictures can be seen in figures 2.21. We see a thunderbolt in his hand, a crown upon his head, and the symbol of Jupiter next to the thunderbolt. Another detailed old picture of Jupiter can be seen in figures 2.22. Medieval pictures of the planet Saturn often referred to the imagery of Saturn, the Roman god of death. The standard astronomical representation of Saturn is that of a person with the scythe of death in his hands. The medieval astronomical symbols of Saturn include the sickle and the scythe. A well-known book by Leopoldus of Austria, allegedly dating from 1489, has a picture of a scythe and the inscription Saturn next to it, figures 2.23. Tesnero's book of 1562 depicts the planet Saturn with a scythe and devouring a child. The scythe, or the sickle, are often located over the head of Saturn and bear visible resemblance to the Ottoman crescent or horns. It may be that the fear and respect that the inhabitants of the medieval Western Europe had for the Ottomans caused the Ottoman crescent to become a symbol of punishment. The identification of ancient Egyptian god Anubis with the Roman Saturn is described in the oeuvres of the Egyptologist H. Bruggs and the expert in the history of religions J. Fraser. The Egyptian Anubis is most frequently portrayed with long pointed jackal ears, somewhat curved. In figures 2.25 and 2.26, it is possible that the Ottoman crescent would occasionally be compared with long pointed jackal ears. In Tesnero's book, Saturn's chariot is drawn by a griffin and an asp, monsters of death. The representation of the planet Saturn on the round zodiac is as follows. Behind the Virgo constellation and beneath it we see two male figures crowned by crescents, one of them bearing a staff and the other a large scythe. No other figure on the round zodiac, including constellations, has a scythe. Virgo is portrayed here in exactly the same manner as it is on the medieval astronomical charts, as a woman holding an ear of wheat, figures 2.27. Let us remind the reader that the constellation contains a well-known star, Spica, or the ear of wheat. The figure of Saturn is drawn with a jackal's head. Numerous Egyptian pictures of Saturn accompanying people to the underworld are well known. See figures 2.28, 2.29, 2.30, and 2.31. For instance, Incidentally, one clearly recognized the well-known Christian doomsday theme of the ancient Egyptian pictures in figures 2.3 and 2.31, one of the most popular themes in medieval Christian art. We see Jesus Christ sitting on a throne and pronouncing judgment. The scribe in front of him is reading a scroll or the book of fate, where all the deeds of the dead are listed. The god Anubis is weighing the good and the bad deeds on his scale in order to determine whether the person should go to heaven or to hell. This is clearly an illustration of the Christian apocalypse, or the revelation of St. John the Divine. This means all such ancient Egyptian drawings belong to a Christian epoch, which couldn't have preceded the 11th century, according to the new chronology. Furthermore, the medieval pictures of Venus emphasize the fact that Venus was the only female among planets, not counting the moon and the sun, naturally. Astronomical maps practically always represent Venus as a woman. The medieval symbols of the planet Venus can be seen in figures 2.32 and 2.33. This first picture is a close-up of a fragment of an ancient picture taken from the French astronomical manuscript cited above. In figures 2.33, we see an ancient miniature called the planet Venus. Venus is also represented as a woman and has her name written over her head in figures 2.34. Let us remind the reader that Venus resembles Mercury in being positioned relatively close to the sun. We see the astronomical symbol for the sun in medieval books, a large disk with a point in its center. In the drawings in the medieval book by Tesnero, as well as the medieval book by Al-Musar, the usual astronomical symbol for the moon is a narrow crescent. How did the ancient Egyptians draw the sun and the moon? On the round zodiac, directly over Pisces, we can see a disk that contains an all-electron's eye. Let us remind the reader that the cock that cries at dawn is a natural symbol of the moon or the rising sun. On the other hand, the brightest star in the constellation of Aries is called the Eye, and the disk with an eye could really indicate that the sun or the moon were in Aries. The fact that in certain cases the Alectryon disk could be associated with the moon is also reflected on another stone bas-relief on the dome of the great Dendera temple close to the entrance. There is no planetary horoscope here. However, one sees a large number of separate representations of celestial objects. We can see a disk with an Alectryon's eye yet again, with a crescent circumscribing it. The reference to either the moon or the sun is apparent on figures 2.37 and 2.38. Furthermore, we see an identical Alectryon eye disk on this bas-relief, this time accompanied by 14 identical human figures. The reader will recall that a lunar month contains 28 days, so that we see here, the reader will recall that a lunar month contains 28 days. So what we see here can probably be identified as representations of halves of lunar months or fortnights. Each day is represented by a small figure. All of the figures are identical, as similar days, coming one after another. This may be the way the artist represents the 14-day interval between the new moon and the full moon. That is separated into 2 weeks, each with 7 figures for days. Furthermore, the second lunar disk is sailing the skies in a boat that clearly resembles a crescent in figures 2.39. Let us also point out that both lunar disks on the dome near the entrance clearly depict some celestial deity, since they are worshipped by other figures. However, in this case, our identification of the Alectrian disk as the moon or the sun coincides with that offered by the Scaligerate Egyptologists. They are of the opinion that Osiris had the double name Osiris Moon, and a disk such as this one used to be one of his symbols. However, one should also bear in mind that Osiris used to symbolize the sun. We can see that a final identification of any particular disk on the Egyptian zodiac as the moon or the sun is only feasible after all possible options are tried and all the necessary astronomical calculations performed. Medieval drawings of Mercury were based on the idea that both Mercury and Janus were considered gods of trade and patrons of contracts of all sorts. Janus is the ancient Roman god with two faces. His two faces face different sides. See figures 2.42 and 2.43. Mercury is always close to the sun and never drifts too far away from it. In Tessanero's book, we see Mercury's famous caduceus resembling a trident in the hands of the planet Mercury. Another depiction of Mercury, allegedly dating from the 16th century, can be seen in figures 2.45. We shall limit ourselves to these examples, since in Cron 3 Part 2, we shall study all possible planet identification options for the Egyptian zodiacs with great care and select a finite version. However, one shouldn't think that one should not think that what we encounter in the Egyptian zodiacs is the fixed result of a real astronomical observation. The fact is that in the Middle Ages, certain important dates were apparently written down as picture horoscopes or celestial dates of sort. This is why when a temple commemorating some ancient event would be erected in the 16th through 18th century. For instance, the zodiacal dislocation of the planets could well be calculated for the ancient date in question and then depicted on the dome of the temple. Let us now report the datings of the horoscope depicted on the long Dendera zodiac. This bas relief used to be on the dome of the temple in the hall one enters via the main entrance. In A. Morozov offered the following astronomical solution, basing it on his partial decipherment. April 6, 540 AD. N. S. Kellyan and D. V. Desenko extended the analysis methods and offered April the 14th, 1394 as an astronomical solution. An even more detailed, albeit also partial, decipherment of the long zodiac, as well as its dating, were performed by T. N. Fomenko. The result was April 7th or 8th, 1727. The finite answer obtained by A. T. Fomenko and G. V. Novensky in 2001 shall be formulated below. Sections 5.3. The horoscopes of Bruggs and Flinders-Petrie. In 1857, the eminent Egyptologist Henry Bruggs found an ancient Egyptian wooden coffin in Egypt that was in a remarkable condition, as if it were created in a very recent period, figures 2.46. It contained a typical ancient Egyptian mummy. On the inside of the lid were a symbolic representation of the starlit sky with planets affixed to constellations. A horoscope, in other words. The entire burial rite, the artwork, and especially the demotic scripture doubtlessly indicated, according to Scaligerate historians, that the finding was exceptionally ancient. Bruggs himself dated it to the 1st century AD at the earliest. The demotic inscriptions are close to the figures of certain zodiacal constellations and make direct references to the planets they contain. The situation is extremely advantageous. Indeed, all the necessary astronomical information is given clearly and accurately by the creators of this remarkable ancient Egyptian sepulchre. All the researchers of the horoscope were hypnotized by the alleged antiquity of the demotic scripture, first discovered by Ackerblade 20 years prior to Champollion deciphering hieroglyphic writing, and dated the artifact to the historical epoch corresponding to the Scaligean chronology of Egypt. What ensued was a series of attempts made by astronomers to ascribe the horoscope to the very historical epoch that concurs with the Scaligean version of the Egyptian chronology. This, however, has failed to yield any results, since, as was the case with the Dendera zodiacs, the ancient sky from deep antiquity and until the first centuries of the new era has never been positioned the way the lid of the sarcophagus depicts it. The astronomer M.A. Veliv went a little further along the time axis than the other astronomers. However, he didn't go beyond the first couple of centuries of the new era. It is interesting that despite N.A. Morozov's numerous suggestions, M.A. Veliv refused to carry on with the research so that it would include the Middle Ages as well, since this would blatantly contradict Scaligean chronology, which Veliv did not doubt in the least. N.A. Morozov proceeded with the calculations and went forward in time. N.A. Morozov discovered that the following astronomical solution, basing his calculations on his own partial decipherment of the zodiac found by Bruggs, November 17th, 1682. The final 2001 solution of A.T. Fomenko and G.V. Nozevsky will be formulated below. In 1901, the eminent Egyptologist W.M. Flinders Petrie found an artificial cave in Upper Egypt near Sohag that was used as an ancient Egyptian sepulchre. Its walls were covered by ancient artwork and graffiti, and there were 2 color horoscopes on the ceiling. In 1919, academician B.A. Turiev suggested to perform an astronomical dating of the horoscopes to N.A. Morozov. Their preliminary analysis and deciphering were performed by E.B. Nobel in Britain, who also gave preliminary datings to the horoscopes. The dates he obtained were as follows: May 20th, 52 AD, and January 20th, 59 AD. However, E.B. Noble remarked that he found the position of Mercury in the second horoscope quite dubious. In other words, the solution he offered only satisfied the conditions if one was to close one's eyes at some inconsistencies. As for the first horoscope, he put forth the hypothesis that the planetary positions were calculated by the astronomer who had painted it and not actually observed. The planets were far away from the positions indicated in the horoscope on January 20th, 59 AD. Apart from Mercury, E.B. Noble had his doubts about the position of Venus in the first horoscope. This led E.B. Noble to try out a few other ancient versions pertinent to the epoch where Scaligean Egyptologists had a priori placed them, guided by the style of burial. However, all Noble's attempts to find a better astronomical solution turned out utterly fruitless. All the other options that he had researched satisfied to the given conditions even less. Furthermore, when M.A. Veliv verified Noble's calculations, it turned out that Noble had been somewhat imprecise with Mars and Saturn as well. This made both Noble's dates 52 AD and 59 AD highly questionable. Then M.A. Veliv performed another series of calculations and offered his own solution of 186 BC and 179 BC. However, it turned out that the subconscious or conscious desire of M.A. Veliv to make the solution fit into the historical interval a priori defined by Scaliger chronology of ancient Egypt led him to several unjustified allowances. In 544, volume 6, pages 733 to 736, all of Vliv's calculations are cited, with all of their errors and deviations pointed out as a good example of what a desire to save Scaligeриan chronology by all means might lead to. Then M.A. Vliv put forth a hypothesis that the couple of 349 and 355 AD would provide a better fit. However, numerous verifications proved this pair to be even worse than the first solution. Another similar attempt also led to a complete fiasco. N.A. Morozov carried on with the research. However, he also failed to find a precise astronomical solution. This was beginning to look most peculiar indeed. The character of the painted horoscopes clearly indicated that the ancient painter was fully aware of what he was painting, and not just making the artwork up as he went along. Then N.A. Morozov started to suspect that the horoscope had been deciphered incorrectly. He analyzed the horoscope and suggested another interpretation, a more logical one in his opinion. It was partial as well. However, the astronomical solution for the problem presented itself as May 6th, 1049 for the upper horoscope and February 9th, 1065 for the lower. Now we are ready to consider the finite answer obtained by A.T. Fomenko and G.V. Novinsky in 2001. Section 5.4. Finite datings of Egyptian zodiacs based on their complete decipherment as calculated by A.T. Fomenko and G.V. Novinsky in 2001. Let us quote a part of our Introduction to Cron 3. Previous attempts to decipher the ancient Egyptian zodiacs, primarily those of N.A. Morozov, N.S. Kellen, and D.V. Denesco, and T.N. Fomenko, have all been partial, since some part of the zodiacal depictions had remained unidentified. The complications they had to face are perfectly understandable, since to try out all possible permutations, one would have to perform a gigantic amount of calculations impossible to do manually. The decipherment we obtained in 2001 was the first one to be completed, with an exhaustive computer search of every symbol in the zodiacs that was interpreted ambiguously. The singular, complete decipherment possible was the only one that accounted for everything depicted on the zodiacs, and allowed for an astronomical solution to boot. This fact is extremely important. The very existence of a complete and datable decipherment is anything but obvious. Furthermore, our astronomical solution is the only one possible. This makes our decipherment finite. Apparently, the complete decipherment that we performed includes the partial decipherments formerly offered by N.A. Morozov and T.N. Fomenko, but differs from them somewhat in details. These differences have the shape of circumstantiations in the complex situations where one would formally have to choose between a great number of possible options. This concerns the differing symbols for the sun and the moon as used by astronomers in the Middle Ages. All of the previously mentioned researchers did not perform any computer search basing their choice on the analysis of the ancient Egyptian symbols in general. Their interpretations were not finite in a number of cases. Therefore, the dates they came up with could not fit ideally. This explains the fact that the precise datings calculated by the authors differ from the ones calculated previously by N.A. Morozov, N.S. Kellen, and D.V. Denesco, and T.N. Fomenko. However, it is significant that all the exact dates remain medieval. It turns out that no finite astronomical solution for the Egyptian zodiac goes further back in time than the 12th century AD. Let us reemphasize the computer calculations allowed us to discover that the previous partial decipherments provided for the foundation of the finite complete interpretation of the zodiac, confirming that the research of our predecessors had been conducted in the correct general direction. The computer datings that we have come up with for the ancient Egyptian zodiacs are as follows. The round zodiac of Dendera, the morning of March 20th, 1185 AD. The long zodiac of Dendera, April 22nd to the 26th, 1168 AD. The zodiac from the Greater Temple of Esna, March 31st to April 3rd, 1394 AD. The zodiac from the Lesser Temple of Esna, May 6th through May 8th, 1404 AD. The Anthribian horoscope of Flinders Petrie. The Upper Zodiac, May 16th, 1230 AD. The Lower Zodiac, February 10th, 1268 AD. The Horoscope of Thebes by H. Bruggs. The Horoscope of Demotic Subscripts, November 18th, 1861. The Horoscope Without Staves, October 7th, 1841 AD. The Horoscope with Boats, February 15th, 1853 AD. The Color Horoscope of Thebes, Luxor, September 8th, 1182. This research of ours proved to include a great body of material that was quite complex. It turned into an entire book that we include in Cron 3. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think I'm going to end that one there. This one is really rich with different figures and a lot of in-depth investigations into the hieroglyphics and the constellations that were, if you believe Fomenko, that were dated to rather recently. That, I mean, he gives plenty of evidence to show that what Scaliger and Petavius did was just to take some of the horoscopes of their day and backdate them. And it really seems a lot like what people would do if they were trying to, it's like they're guessing, or it's like, I don't know that they're deliberately trying to build a false history. It seems to me that they are, I don't know, maybe they are, but it seems like they just don't know and they're guessing. And that's what our scientists do today, right? I mean, it's really no different than what's happening with COVID. Are they trying to cover something up, or are they just being dummies? Anyways, that's all I got for today. We're going to be moving into the next chapters. We're going to move into some really awesome stuff. We're going to get into the astronomy of the New Testament and the new dating of the astronomical horoscopes as described by the Apocalypse. So thank you for spending time with me. I hope you're having a great day. Aloha.